Let's turn now to what the assassination did to the liberalism of its day. Let's say Camelot and the American liberal. Again, to quote from Camelot and the Cultural Revolution, quote, "The most potent element of the Kennedy legacy is its association with the legend of King Arthur and Camelot." Very briefly, who came up with that association?
Well, that was Jackie Kennedy who came up with that. She came up with it in the aftermath of the assassination.
Quite quickly thereafter.
Yeah, within a couple of days. And, of course, there was a very popular Broadway play,
right,
Camelot, with the music that many of us have heard. And that was based upon the very influential novel, The Once and Future King, by E.H. White.
E.H. White. And Mrs. Kennedy mentioned Camelot in an interview to Teddy White, one of the great journalists of the day, who published it in Life or Time?
Life magazine,
on
the December 1st issue, a commemorative issue on John F. Kennedy. A week after the assassination, she beckoned Teddy White, no relation to E.H. White, up to Hyannis. And Teddy White dropped everything. He had written this book, The Making of the President, in 1960.
Right. He knew the Kennedys.
He knew the Kennedys very well and knew Jack Kennedy through the 1950s. In an interview that lasted several hours at Hyannis a week afterwards, she unburdened herself of various things that happened in Dallas and then said that she and Jack Kennedy loved the music from Camelot and used the Camelot image to describe the Kennedy administration with the idea that this was a magical time, like the Camelot of legend, with the suggestion that Jack Kennedy was a kind of warrior for peace, because that was the idea of King Arthur that was embedded in the E.H. White novel. So,
don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for happy ever aftering that was known as Camelot. Without intending to do so, you write, Mrs. Kennedy put forth an interpretation of her husband's death that undercut mid-century liberalism at its core. Why?
Mrs. Kennedy, with that image, quite unintentionally, she introduced a sense of nostalgia into liberal thought. The idea that the best of times are now in the past, that the Kennedy years were the best that we could ever hope for, and they're now gone.
And if you're a party committed to the notion of progress, that's fatal.
If your party is based upon the future and progress, that is very much an undermining assumption. If you add to that the idea that we lost this magical time because of some defect of our national culture, the sense of hate and prejudice, that then augments the loss because we now blame ourselves for it.
You note that James Reston published a column in the New York Times the day after the assassination, which carried the headline, quote, "Why America Weeps, Kennedy Victim of Violent Streak He Sought to Curb in Nation," close quote. And so the notion is that somehow the entire country was complicit in the act of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yes,
that's a notion that you write requires a species of doublethink. Explain your view on that.
Well, this appears in the New York Times the day after the assassination,
right.
November 23rd. It's on the front page. Reston, at the time, is really the dean and the most influential of American political
of his
reporters.
Day, right? He was the man.
Yes. And in the center of the front page of the New York Times that day, in the center column, there's a long article on Oswald and his communist associations that they have already within 24 hours of the event. And all of that is stood up. There's been some additions to it, but the key elements, his defection to the Soviet Union.
I had no idea of that. They knew immediately.
They knew that defection to the Soviet Union, return to the United States, working for fair play for Cuba in the summer of 1963, and I believe they also had in that article his attempt to travel to Cuba in the fall of 1963 via the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City. So they have all that very quickly. Adjacent to that, however, is the Reston column, which suggests that President Kennedy is a victim of a streak of hatred and violence in the nation. So you have this juxtaposition of the fact President Kennedy is killed by a communist with the interpretation President Kennedy is a victim of American culture. These two things do not jibe. But what happened was that the interpretation of the event...
You write that Lee Harvey Oswald, I think I can almost quote you on this one, was in no way representative of any trend anywhere in America. He was completely sui generis.
Absolutely. He was not linked really to any of the big left-wing groups. He operated more or less on his own as an underground revolutionary and communist. He was not a right-winger, for sure. He was not a joiner. He did not belong to groups. He was the kind of figure who was thrown up by post-war America, who was absorbed into the whirlpool of the Cold War.